Hey there, tonight we are going to delve into something a bit, well, let's call it uncomfortable. It's the sort of history that doesn't usually make it into the glossy school textbooks, mostly because it's a tad too messy for a classroom wall. Before we crack on, do me a massive favour and settle yourself in properly. Dim the lights if you can. It would be lovely if you'd hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I'm always genuinely chuffed to see how far these stories travel across the globe. And while you're down there, tell me which period of history really gets your gears turning. Is it the Tudors, or are you more of a Victorian enthusiast? It was January 1547. London was, quite frankly, a bit of a misery. The Thames was a sluggish ribbon of grey ice, and the kind of damp cold that gets right into your marrow was settled over Whitehall Palace like a heavy, wet blanket. Inside those stone walls, the atmosphere was thick. Not just with the smell of wood smoke and the expensive beeswax candles that the common folk could never dream of owning, but with a palpable, stifling sort of dread. You see, the king was dying. But the thing is, in Tudor England, saying the king was dying was actually a capital offence. It was treason. You could literally lose your head for stating the bleeding obvious. So everyone just sort of shuffled about on tiptoes, whispering in corners and pretending that the massive, wheezing mountain of a man in the royal bedchamber was just having a bit of a duvet day. Henry VIII had been on the throne for 38 years. That is a long time to be the most terrifying man in the room. He had gone from being the golden prince, the athletic, handsome lad who could out-wrestle, out-dance and out-hunt anyone in Europe to this. A colossus of meat and misery. He was 55 years old, which doesn't sound ancient to us now, but in the 16th century, after a lifetime of excess and some truly spectacular medical neglect, he was a wreck. He was roughly the size of a small shed. His waist, which had once been a trim 32 inches in his youth, had expanded to a staggering 54 inches. Imagine that. He was so heavy that they had to build these elaborate mechanical hoists, a bit like primitive lifts just to get him up the stairs or onto his horse. It was undignified, really. A man who considered himself a god on earth being winched about like a sack of coal. The Palace of Whitehall was the largest in Europe at the time, a sprawling mess of over 1,500 rooms. It was a labyrinth. And right at the heart of it, in the privy chambers, the king lay. The air in those rooms must have been absolutely foul. Because of the ulcers on his legs, which we'll talk about more in a bit, the smell was reportedly something you could practically lean against. They tried to mask it, of course. They burned expensive herbs and strewed the floors with fresh rushes and rose water, but there's only so much a bit of lavender can do against the scent of a monarch who is literally rotting while still breathing. The courtiers were terrified, and I don't mean nervous about a performance review, terrified. I mean wondering if today is the day I get sent to the Tower, terrified. Henry's temper had always been a bit touchy, but in his final months, it was like a landmine. One wrong word, one look that suggested you noticed how ill he was, and that was it. Gone. So they kept the charade going. They brought him massive meals that he could barely eat. They brought him documents to sign, though he could barely hold a pen. Eventually they had to use something called the dry stamp, which was essentially a wooden block with his signature carved into it. They'd stamp the paper, and then someone else would ink over it. It was a bit dodgy, legally speaking, but when the king is a giant who can't move his fingers, you make do. It's strange to think about the silence of those mornings. You'd have the guards standing outside the doors, their halberds gleaming in the dim light, and inside the most powerful man in English history was just fading. He was a shadow of the man who had broken with Rome and married 6 wives and generally turned the world upside down. I wonder what he thought about during those long, cold nights in January. Did he regret any of it? Did he think about Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn or the way he'd treated his daughters? Probably not. Henry wasn't really the regret type. He was more the blame everyone else for my problems type. The physicians were in a right old state. They knew the end was coming, but they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. If they told him he was dying, they were traitors. If they didn't cure him, they were useless. So they poked and prodded and applied these horrifying poultices made of things like pigeon dung and lead, which, as you can imagine, did absolutely nothing to help. It was a farce, really. A very grim, very expensive farce. The mornings were the worst. The grey light would filter through the stained glass, showing the dust motes in the air of a room that had become a tomb before its time. You'd hear the muffled sounds of the city outside, the cries of the watermen on the Thames, totally unaware that the era of the Great Harry was sputtering out in a cloud of sickness and incense. It's that contrast that gets me. The world keeps turning, the bread still needs baking, the laundry still needs doing, even while a giant is falling. He was so isolated at the end. Despite the hundreds of people in the palace, he was incredibly alone. His sixth wife, Catherine Parr, was there, but she was basically acting as a high-stakes nurse, and even she had nearly lost her head just a few months earlier. There was no one he could truly trust. Everyone was just waiting. They were like vultures on a fence watching the clock, waiting for that final breath so they could start the scramble for power. It's a bit tragic in a way if you can find it in your heart to feel sorry for a man who had so many people executed. But that's the thing about the Tudors, isn't it? They're so larger than life that we forget they were made of flesh and bone. And in Henry's case, an awful lot of both. As the winter frost thickened on the windows of Whitehall, the king's world was shrinking down to the four corners of his bed. The great hunts were over. The grand banquets were a memory. All that was left was the cold, the pain, and the growing realization that even a king can't outrun the inevitable. It's a bit of a sobering thought, really. No matter how many palaces you build or how many laws you rewrite, the morning eventually comes when you can't get out of bed. To truly understand the collapse of the Tudor state in those final months, you really have to look at the collapse of the Tudor body. It is quite a grim thing to contemplate, really, especially when you contrast it with the man he used to be. If you had seen Henry in the 1520s, you would have seen the absolute pinnacle of Renaissance manhood. He was tall, nearly 6'2", which made him a literal giant in an age when the average chap was significantly shorter. He was the Golden Prince, a man who could out-wrestle the King of France and spend 10 hours in the saddle without breaking a sweat. But by 1547, that magnificent height was being crushed under the sheer, unadulterated mass of his own flesh. It wasn't just that he was fat. He was unwell in a way that modern medicine would find quite fascinating, if not entirely stomach-turning. The turning point, the moment the wheels really started to come off the wagon, was that infamous jousting accident in 1536. He was 44, still thinking he was a young buck, when he was unhorsed at Greenwich. The horse, clad in full-plate armour, fell right on top of him. He was out cold for 2 hours. Some people think he suffered a brain injury that changed his personality, turned him from a difficult man into a monster. But the physical legacy was far more immediate and visible. His legs, specifically his left leg, never really recovered. What started as a nasty bruise turned into something much more sinister. It became a chronic, weeping ulcer. Now, the medical wisdom of the day was, frankly, a bit of a shambles. They didn't understand infection, obviously. They believed in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The doctors convinced themselves that Henry's leg ulcers were actually a blessing. They thought these open sores were a vent for the evil humours to escape the king's body. Consequently, they didn't want the wounds to heal. Can you imagine that? Every time the skin tried to knit back together, the royal physicians would step in and force it back open. They used red-hot irons or caustic burning chemicals to keep the flesh raw and draining. It is the stuff of nightmares. He was the most powerful man in the country, and he was being tortured by his own doctors in the name of health. By the end, these ulcers were probably what we would call osteomyelitis, a deep-seated bone infection. They were foul-smelling, which is a polite way of saying they stank of rotting meat. The infection was constant, sending waves of fever through him and making his temper even more volatile than usual. Because of the pain, he stopped moving. And because he stopped moving, he got bigger. And because he got bigger, the pressure on his legs became unbearable. It was a vicious, cruel cycle. He became a prisoner in his own skin, a mountain of a man trapped in a chair or a bed, unable to even walk across a room without several burly attendants heaving him along. His diet certainly didn't help matters. He was basically a meat processing plant on legs. He consumed thousands upon thousands of calories every day. We're talking about vast quantities of venison, beef, mutton and game birds, like cygnet and heron. Vegetables were almost entirely absent from the royal table, because in the Tudor mind, roots and herbs were the food of the poor. If you were a king, you ate meat and you ate sugar. He had a massive sweet tooth, which meant his teeth were in a shocking state, likely black and decaying, adding a lovely bit of toothache to his list of daily miseries. All that sugar and protein led to gout, a condition that makes the joints feel like they're being pierced with hot needles. Imagine the logistical nightmare of just getting him dressed. He had these magnificent jewel-encrusted doublets, but they had to be made wider and wider every single month. His legs had to be wrapped in tight silk bandages to try and stem the flow of fluid from the ulcers, but the bandages would soak through in minutes. The smell in the room must have been quite something. They used to say you could tell the king was coming 3 rooms away, not by the sound of his footsteps because he couldn't walk, but by the scent of his decay. It is a bit of a jarring image, isn't it? This man who claimed to be the supreme head of the Church of England, the representative of God on earth, sitting there in a cloud of perfume and rot. He had become a bit of a gelatinous mass, really. His legs were so swollen with edema, or dropsy, as they called it, that the skin was stretched tight and shiny like a drum. I think about the poor souls who had to bathe him. That was a job for the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, the highest-ranking nobles in the land. Imagine being an earl or a duke, and your primary responsibility is to wash the weeping sores of a 500-pound man who might have you executed if you accidentally poke him too hard. It was a high-stakes, highly unpleasant existence. The sheer weight of him was a constant problem. He was so heavy that the floorboards in some of the older parts of the palace actually groaned when his mechanical chair was wheeled over them. He had this thing called a tram, which was a sort of early wheelchair, but even then it took a team of men to move him. He must have felt so diminished. This was a man who had built his entire identity on his physical prowess. He had been the Herculean king. To end up as a blubbering, sedentary figure, unable to even attend to his own basic needs, must have been a psychic blow as much as a physical one. And yet, despite all this, he refused to let go of the reins. He stayed in control, or at least he tried to. He would sit in his chair, his legs propped up on cushions, and stare at his courtiers with those small, pig-like eyes, watching for any sign of weakness or disrespect. He knew they were waiting for him to die. He wasn't stupid. He could see them whispering in the shadows of the long gallery. He knew the doctors were lying to him about his progress. The pain must have been a constant screaming background noise to every decision he made. When you're in that much agony, your perspective on the world tends to get a bit skewed. Perhaps that explains some of the more, let's say, drastic decisions of his final years. It's a strange, lingering sort of death, isn't it? Not a quick, heroic end on a battlefield, but a slow, messy dissolution in a room that smelled of lavender and gangrene. It's the kind of detail they leave out of the portraits. Hans Holbein did a grand job of making him look like a solid wall of power, but the reality in 1547 was a man who was literally falling apart. The Tudor crown, for all its gold and jewels, had become a crushing weight that his body simply could no longer support. Imagine, if you will, the long gallery at Whitehall. It was a space designed for pacing, for contemplation, and for the most dangerous sport in England, conversation. In those final, freezing weeks of January, the gallery was less a place of exercise and more a hall of mirrors where every reflection was distorted by fear. The court was a pressure cooker, really, and the lid was vibrating with the steam of 1,000 secrets. You see, the king's physical state was a secret that everyone knew, but no one was allowed to name. It created this bizarre collective hallucination where the more obvious his impending death became, the more frantically the courtiers had to pretend he was simply having a bit of a lie-in. It was a perilous time to be anyone of importance. The atmosphere wasn't just thick with the smell of the king's decline, it was heavy with the scent of old blood and fresh ink. The factions, the reformers led by the ambitious Edward Seymour and the conservatives, clustered around the Duke of Norfolk, were like 2 packs of wolves circling a dying stag. They weren't looking at the king with any sort of genuine affection, I suspect. They were looking at his signature. Or rather, they were looking at that dry stamp I mentioned earlier. If you controlled the hand that moved the stamp, you controlled the future of the English soul. The silence in the palace was quite unnatural, wasn't it? Usually the Tudor court was a riot of noise lutes playing, dogs barking, the constant clatter of plates and the roar of laughter. But in January 1547 the volume had been turned right down. People spoke in these low, hurried murmurs, their eyes constantly darting toward the heavy oak doors of the privy chamber. Every time those doors creaked open, a shiver would ripple through the gallery. Was it a doctor, a priest, or was it a guard coming to arrest someone for the crime of looking a bit too relieved? The fear was perfectly rational, to be fair. Just look at what happened to the Howards. The Duke of Norfolk and his son, the Earl of Surrey, were the very upper crust of the old nobility. They were as blue-blooded as they come. Yet, even as Henry lay there wheezing, he found the energy to sign Surrey's death warrant. The Earl was executed on Tower Hill on the 19th of January, just 9 days before the King himself would kick the bucket. The King is so close to the grave he can probably smell the damp earth, yet he's still making sure his perceived enemies go there first. It was a final twitching lash of the dragon's tail. The Duke of Norfolk only escaped the axe because the King had the common decency to die the very night before the Duke was scheduled to be beheaded. Talk about a lucky break, though I imagine his nerves were absolutely shot to bits. This was the environment these people were living in. It was a game of musical chairs where the music could stop at any second, and if you weren't sitting in the right spot, you didn't just lose the game, you lost your head. I often wonder about the minor servants, the ones who didn't have titles but saw everything, the grooms of the stool, the laundry maids, the boys who turned the spits in the kitchens. They must have been terrified too, but in a more practical, where is my next meal coming from sort of way. If the king dies, the whole household is dissolved. Thousands of people suddenly out of a job, cast out into the winter cold. So the gossip wasn't just about high politics. It was about survival. They'd watch the physicians' faces as they came out of the royal bedchamber, trying to read the future in the bags under their eyes, or the set of their mouths. The long gallery itself was a triumph of Tudor architecture, all gleaming wood and expensive glass. But in the winter light, it must have felt like a cage. You couldn't leave. If you were a member of the court, you were expected to be there, to be seen, to be part of the constant vigil. To leave would look like you were abandoning the king, which was a one-way ticket to the tower. So you stayed, you paced, you whispered, you watched the frost patterns on the glass and prayed you wouldn't be the next person Henry remembered he didn't like. There's a certain grim irony in it all, isn't there? Henry had spent his whole life trying to ensure a peaceful, stable succession, yet he'd created a court so riddled with paranoia that nobody felt safe. He'd broken the church, he'd dismantled the monasteries, he'd rewritten the laws of the land to suit his whims, and the end result was a room full of terrified men and women whispering in the dark. It's a bit of a mess, really. The religious tension was the real undercurrent, though. This wasn't just about who got to be the young Prince Edward's protector. It was about whether England would stay Catholic without the Pope, or move toward the radical new ideas coming out of Europe. The reformers were hiding Bibles in their sleeves, while the conservatives were clutching their rosaries in the shadows. Everyone was waiting for the king's heart to stop so they could start tearing each other apart. It's quite a grisly thought, the idea of these men hovering around a dying man, not to offer comfort, but to wait for the moment they could grab the crown for their own ends. I suspect the king knew. He was a lot of things cruel, bloated, perhaps a bit mad, but he wasn't a fool. He knew the nature of the men he'd surrounded himself with. He'd spent 38 years teaching them that the only way to survive was to be more ruthless than the person standing next to you. And now, as he lay there, he was watching his own creation play out its final act. He was the sun that everything orbited around, and as that sun began to flicker out, the gravity that held the court together was failing. It must have been exhausting, really. The constant acting, the forced smiles, the careful phrasing of every single sentence. The king is much improved today, don't you think? When everyone knew he was a shade of grey and couldn't even sit up. It was a theatre of the absurd, and the leading man was a dying giant who might, at any moment, decide to take the whole theatre down with him. The courtiers would gather in little knots, their voices dropping whenever a member of the other faction walked past. A nod of the head, a raised eyebrow, a specific way of holding a pair of gloves, everything was a code. Everything meant something. It was a world where a misplaced perhaps could be your undoing. I find it fascinating and utterly horrifying in equal measure. We like to think of history as these grand, sweeping movements, but in 1547 it was all about the whispers in a drafty hallway and the frantic heartbeat of a man who just wanted to live to see the sunrise. As the sun dipped below the horizon each afternoon, casting long, jagged shadows across the gallery floors, the tension would only rack up. The night was when the real business happened. Secret meetings in darkened chambers, letters written in lemon juice, promises made that would be broken before the morning mist cleared. It was a masterpiece of human duplicity. And all the while, the man at the centre of it all, the great Henry, was slowly, inevitably, becoming the past. Now, you might think that being the wealthiest man in the kingdom would buy you the very best medical care available, and in a way, I suppose it did. The trouble was that the best medical care in 1547 was a bit like trying to fix a leaking nuclear reactor with some chewing gum and a very earnest prayer. It was a bizarre, swirling cocktail of genuine herbal knowledge, ancient Greek philosophy, and what we would now consider outright sorcery. The men standing around Henry's bed, fellows like Thomas Huicker and the venerable Dr. Butts, were essentially playing a high-stakes game of guess the symptom, while the executioner's shadow loomed in the doorway. It was a stressful way to earn a living, mind you. The foundation of everything they did was the theory of the four humours. It's a concept that feels utterly alien to us now, isn't it? The idea that your entire physical and mental well-being was dictated by the balance of four liquids. If you were grumpy, you had too much black bile. If you were feverish, your blood was too hot. For Henry, who had spent decades eating enough red meat to sink a small galley and drinking wine like it was water, the doctors were convinced his humours were in a state of absolute riot. They saw his body as a sort of plumbing system that had become catastrophically blocked. Because the king was so hot and moist in his temperament, they tried to balance him with cold remedies. But then you had the ulcers, which they viewed as a necessary evil, a sort of safety valve for the body's internal pressure. It's a bit of a head-scratcher, really. They wanted to cure the king, but they were terrified of closing the wounds because they thought the poison would then back up and kill him instantly. So, they poked and they prodded, and they applied these mixtures that would make a modern chemist weep. They used a lot of lead and mercury for starters. We know now that's a recipe for a slow and miserable poisoning, but back then it was top-tier stuff. They'd mix these heavy metals with things like marshmallow root, turpentine, and even ground-up pearls. Yes, pearls. There was this lingering belief that because a pearl was expensive and beautiful, it must have some sort of inherent purity that could scrub the insides of a king. It's the ultimate prestige medicine, isn't it? If it costs a fortune, it must work. I wonder if Henry ever felt the grit of those ground-up jewels in his tonics and thought, well, at least I'm dying in style. One of the more peculiar aspects of all this was Henry's own involvement. He wasn't just a patient, he was a bit of an amateur apothecary himself. He actually had his own book of medical recipes. He spent hours when he was still mobile tinkering with ingredients to create his own plasters and ointments. He had one called the King's Own Plaster, which contained a lovely mix of litharge, silver, and something called red lead. He genuinely thought he could outsmart nature with his own concoctions. There's a certain hubris in that, don't you think? A man who thinks he can command the very cells of his body as easily as he commanded his parliaments. But, as the winter of 1547 deepened, the science began to give way to something a bit more desperate. When the herbs and the lead-lined salves failed, the physicians turned to the stars. Astrology wasn't seen as a bit of fun at the back of a newspaper then. It was a serious academic discipline. They would consult the king's natal chart, looking at the alignment of Mars and Saturn to decide the best time to administer a laxative or a bloodletting. It's a strange image, isn't it? A group of highly educated men standing in a room that smells of vinegar and old meat, staring at a star chart to figure out if Jupiter is in the right house to help the king's bowels. There was also the magic side of things. They used charms and specific prayers, often written on bits of parchment and tucked under the king's pillow. They used cramp rings, which were rings Henry himself had hallowed on Good Friday, believing they had the power to cure epilepsy and muscle spasms. It was a world where the boundary between a doctor and a wizard was incredibly thin. And yet, For all the gold and the stars and the hallowed rings, the king was still slipping away. The medicine was failing, and the physicians knew it. Dr. Butts, who had been with Henry for years, was perhaps the only one who could be even remotely honest with him. But even he had to be careful. There's a story that Butts once told Henry that he needed to settle his affairs, but he did it with such careful, flowery language that the king could almost ignore the underlying message. You had to wrap the truth in so much velvet that it barely felt like a truth at all. The palace was full of these distilled waters and cordials that were meant to comfort the heart, but they were really just expensive placebos. The smell in the sick room was managed by burning pastilles, little pellets of incense, rosemary and cloves. They also used vinegar of the Four Thieves, a potent herbal vinegar that was supposed to protect against the plague. I imagine the air was so thick with these competing scents that it was difficult to breathe, let alone recover. It was a sensory overload of the most morbid kind. The most advanced treatment they had was probably the application of a cautery, which is a fancy way of saying they burned the flesh with a hot iron to stop bleeding or to draw out the bad humours. It's a wonder the king didn't die of pure shock from the treatments alone. He was a man of immense physical courage, but even he must have dreaded the arrival of the physicians with their jars and their irons. Every remedy was an ordeal. I often think about the apothecary's shop within the palace. It must have been a hive of activity, with mortars and pestles clinking away at all hours of the night. They were grinding up things like unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk, but don't tell them that, and mummy powder, actual ground-up remains from Egyptian tombs. It's a bit macabre, the idea of a king of England consuming bits of an ancient pharaoh to try and stay alive. It's a sort of cannibalistic desperation, a reach across the centuries for a cure that didn't exist. As the days ticked by, the mood in that apothecary shop must have shifted from busy to frantic, and finally to a sort of grim resignation. You can only grind so many pearls before you realise that the king's body has simply had enough. The humours weren't just out of balance, the vessel was breaking, and no amount of gold or star-guided vinegar was going to put it back together. The physicians, I believe, were ultimately just observers of a long, slow shipwreck. They were there to document the sinking, not to stop it. It's a bit of a lonely position to be in, isn't it? Holding a jar of useless ointment while the history of a nation shifts right in front of your eyes. It's a funny thing, isn't it? How we often picture the wives of Henry VIII as these static figures in a portrait gallery, frozen in their velvet and pearls, rather than living, breathing women trying to navigate a literal minefield. By the time we reached the tail end of 1546 and the start of 1547, Catherine Parr was arguably the most skilled minesweeper in England. She was his sixth, and as the old rhyme goes, the one who survived, though I suspect that survival felt like a very close-run thing most days. She wasn't just a queen, she was a high-stakes palliative nurse with a target on her back. You see, Catherine was a bit too clever for her own good, at least according to the men who wanted her gone. She was a reformist, a woman who actually enjoyed a bit of theological debate, which is a bit like playing with matches in a room full of gunpowder when your husband is a king who thinks he's the only one allowed to have an opinion on God. Only a few months before Henry's final decline, she'd nearly been arrested. The warrant was signed, the guards were on their way, and she only saved her skin by throwing herself at Henry's feet and claiming she only argued with him to distract him from his pain. It was a brilliant bit of acting. She turned her intellect into a form of wifely devotion. But that kind of thing leaves a mark on a person's nerves, doesn't it? In those final weeks at Whitehall, Catherine was in a bit of a sticky wicket. She was there, in the thick of the smell and the fever, tending to those horrific legs and trying to keep the king's spirits up, while all around her, the men of the court were already mentally measuring her for a widow's weeds. She was remarkably composed by all accounts. She was sitting by his bed, the light of a single candle flickering on the silk hangings, reading to him in a soft voice, while the king drifted in and out of a morphine-like haze of pain and medication. It must have been an exhausting, lonely vigil. She was surrounded by enemies like Bishop Gardiner, who were just waiting for her to slip up, to say something a bit too Protestant, so they could pounce. The relationship between them at the end is quite difficult to pin down. Was there love there? Perhaps a sort of weary, companionable affection. Henry had always liked women who were intelligent, even if he occasionally tried to kill them for it. Catherine provided a stability that his court desperately lacked. She had brought his children together, Mary, Elizabeth, and the little Prince Edward, creating a sort of family unit that was mostly a polite fiction but served a purpose. But as Henry grew more monstrous in his physical form, I imagine the affection was increasingly masked by a sheer grinding necessity to stay on his good side. One bad mood, one sudden whim of a dying man, and she could have ended up in the Tower alongside the Earl of Surrey. It's a bit of a grim thought. To be married to a man who is literally falling apart, knowing that your life depends entirely on his fading pulse. If he died too soon, before her position was secure, she was vulnerable. If he lived too long in his madness, she was in danger of his whims. She was walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers, and she had to do it while smelling of the vinegar and rotting flesh we've already discussed. I don't think we give her enough credit for the sheer mental fortitude that must have required. She was a woman of 34, in the prime of her life, tied to a decaying monument of a man. The factional fighting I mentioned earlier didn't stop at the door of the Queen's chambers. If anything, it was more intense there. The Seymours, Edward's uncles, were ostensibly her allies because they shared her reformist leanings. But in the Tudor court, an ally was just someone who hadn't betrayed you yet. They were using her as a buffer, a way to keep access to the king while they plotted the regency. Catherine, maybe, knew exactly what they were up to. She was no fool. She had been a widow twice before she married Henry. She knew how the world worked for a woman alone. There's a specific kind of silence that settles over a house when someone is dying, a sort of heavy, expectant hush. In the Queen's apartments, that silence must have been deafening. She was excluded from the final, most secret meetings of the council. As the king's breath became more laboured, the men moved in, pushing her to the periphery. It's a classic move. Use the woman for the nursing and the comfort, then shove her aside when it's time to divide the spoils. Had she ever had a moment of pure, unadulterated terror in those last nights? Did she look at the king, this man who had changed the course of her life so drastically, and feel a sense of relief that it was almost over? It would be only human, to be free of the fear, free of the smell, free of the constant looming threat of the executioner. But she couldn't show a hint of it. She had to remain the grieving, devoted consort until the very last second. It was a performance that lasted for years, and the final act was the most dangerous of all. The king, in his more lucid moments, seemed to appreciate her. He left her a significant amount of money and jewels in his will, roughly £7,000, which was a staggering sum, and the right to live in his palaces. It was a sign that, at the very end, he did view her as his legitimate queen and a woman of honour. But he didn't give her what she probably wanted most, a seat on the Regency Council. He didn't trust a woman to have power over his son, not even a woman as capable as Catherine. Even in death, Henry was a man of his time, and his time was one of deep-seated suspicion toward any woman with a brain. So, Catherine Parr waited. She watched the shadows move across the tapestries in Whitehall. She listened to the king's rattling breath. She smelled the incense burning to cover the rot, and she navigated the treacherous tides of the court with a grace that is frankly staggering. She survived Henry VIII not just by luck, but by a sheer, calculated brilliance. While the men were sharpening their knives, she was sharpening her wits. And as the king's light finally began to gutter out, she was already looking toward a future where she might finally, for the first time in her life, be her own mistress. But before that could happen, there was the small matter of the king's final exit, and the utter chaos that would follow it. While the Queen was performing her quiet stoic duty in the dim light of the royal bedchamber, a very different sort of activity was humming away in the rooms just beyond the velvet curtains. If the king's bedside was a place of stagnant decay, the council chambers were a hive of frantic, almost electric energy. You see, everyone knew the inevitable was perched on the bedpost, and in the 16th century the death of a monarch wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a total reboot of the national operating system. The man of the hour, the one you really have to keep your eye on in this part of our story, was Edward Seymour, the Earl of Hertford. He was the brother of the late Jane Seymour, which made him the uncle of the little Prince Edward, and in the shark tank of Tudor politics, having a blood connection to the heir was like holding an ace of spades in a game where the loser gets executed. Hertford wasn't alone in his ambitions, of course. He had a very useful, very clever partner in crime called Sir William Paget. Paget was the king's secretary, the man who controlled the flow of information, the gatekeeper of the royal ear. Between them, these two were essentially staging a velvet coup while the king was still technically in charge. It's a bit cheeky when you think about it. While Henry was drifting in and out of consciousness, perhaps dreaming of old battles or forgotten wives, Seymour and Paget were in the corridors, whispering about how they'd carve up the kingdom the moment his heart stopped. They weren't interested in the king's soul. They were interested in his signature. Or, more accurately, that dry stamp we keep coming back to. Now, Henry's will is one of the most controversial documents in British history. He had spent years tinkering with it, trying to create a balanced council of 16 men who would rule on behalf of his son until the boy turned 18. He didn't want any one man to have too much power. He was a control freak to the very end, Henry. He wanted to rule from beyond the grave, pulling the strings of the state even when he was nothing but dust. But Seymour and Paget had other ideas. They knew that a council of 16 equal men would be a recipe for absolute chaos, a committee where nothing would ever get done except for a lot of expensive arguing. They wanted a protector. Specifically, Edward Seymour wanted to be that protector. The atmosphere in those outer rooms must have been quite bizarre. You'd have the official business of the realm continuing, the clerks scratching away with their quills, the messengers arriving from the borders, all while this high-stakes conspiracy was unfolding in the shadows. There was a sense of hurry up and wait. They needed Henry to die so they could get on with the business of ruling, but they also needed him to stay alive just long enough to ensure their version of the will was the one that stood. It was a macabre sort of clock-watching. Every time a physician emerged from the privy chamber, Paget and Seymour would exchange a look, a tiny nod of the head that said, "Not yet, then." And what of the boy at the centre of all this? Prince Edward was only 9 years old. He was a bright lad, incredibly studious, a bit of a miracle child who had survived the nursery when so many of Henry's other children hadn't. He was being kept away from the stench and the horror of his father's deathbed, probably tucked away at Ashridge or Hertford Castle, buried in his Latin and Greek lessons. He was the future, a clean slate upon which these ambitious men hoped to write their own agendas. It's a bit heartbreaking, really. While his father was rotting and the council was plotting, the boy who would be king was probably just wondering when he'd next be allowed to go out and play. The religious divide was the real fuel for this fire. Seymour and Paget were on the side of the reformers. They wanted to push the English Reformation much further than Henry ever had. They wanted to strip away the popish remnants of the church, the Latin Mass, the ornate altars, the belief in purgatory. But to do that, they had to bypass the conservative members of the council, men like Thomas Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor, who was a man so stern he'd personally helped rack a heretic in the Tower. It was a battle for the very soul of England, played out in the hushed tones of a dying man's hallway. I wonder if Henry had any inkling of what was happening. He was a man who had built his entire reign on being the smartest, most ruthless person in the room. Did he see the way Seymour looked at him? Did he notice the way Paget was hovering, waiting for the right moment to use the stamp? Perhaps, in his more lucid moments, he did. But by late January, the sheer weight of his physical suffering probably made the politics feel a bit distant. When every breath is a struggle and your legs are screaming in agony, the question of who sits on a council probably feels a bit academic. He was a giant being pulled down by Lilliputians, and he was simply too tired to swat them away anymore. The sheer audacity of what they were planning is quite something. They were essentially preparing to ignore the king's explicit instructions for a collective regency and instead install a single, powerful leader. It was a high-wire act. If they failed, if the king suddenly recovered, or if the conservative faction got wind of the plan too early, it would be the axe for all of them. But that's the Tudors for you. It was always all or nothing. There was no middle ground, no loyal opposition. You were either at the top of the pile or you were in the dirt. As the nights drew in, the secrecy intensified. There are reports of secret meetings held in the dead of night, where the new men, The ones who had risen to power under Henry rather than being born into it, consolidated their alliances. They were a new breed of politician, efficient, cynical, and utterly devoted to the idea of the state. They were the ones who would carry England into the next century, provided they could survive the next few days. You can almost hear the rustle of their silk robes as they moved through the corridors, the soft thud of the stamp on parchment, the frantic, quiet energy of men who knew they were about to inherit the world. It's easy to judge them, I suppose, to see them as vultures, but in a way they were just doing what Henry had taught them to do. He had created a world where power was the only currency that mattered, and where the only way to protect yourself was to control the king. Now that the king was failing, they were simply securing their own futures in the only way they knew how. It wasn't personal, it was just Tudor business. And while the great Harry wheezed his last in a room filled with incense and regret, the men in the hallway were already looking past him, toward the reign of a 9-year-old boy, and the limitless possibilities of a world without the giant in the bed. The air in the king's bedchamber by the night of the 27th of January had become something almost solid, a heavy and cloying presence that seemed to resist being breathed at all. It was a cocktail of old sweat, the metallic tang of blood from those never-ending ulcers, and the frantic, sweet clouds of incense the servants were tossing onto the braziers in a desperate bid to keep the reality of death at bay. It's quite a thing, really, when you think about it. The most powerful man in Christendom, a man who had rearranged the very heavens to suit his marital requirements, was now reduced to a series of ragged, whistling gasps that echoed off the damp tapestries. The physicians, bless their confused hearts, had finally retreated into the middle distance. They'd run out of ground-up pearls and astrology. They were just men in fur-trimmed robes now, watching the sand run out of the glass. But someone had to be the one to tell him. In the Tudor world, as I've mentioned, suggesting the king was on his way out was a straight ticket to the executioner's block. But Sir Anthony Denny, who was a man of remarkable spine and one of the few Henry actually seemed to tolerate, decided the time for play acting was over. He leaned in close, probably having to hold his breath against the scent of the king's decline, and told Henry that, in the eyes of man, there was no more hope. He suggested the king should prepare himself for the mercy of God. Now, you'd expect a man like Henry, a man who had spent his life roaring at people, to explode at this, but he didn't. He was too far gone for the old pyrotechnics. He simply looked at Denny with those tired, watery eyes and said, in a voice that was barely a rustle of dry leaves, that he would have no one but Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the man who had helped him untangle the mess of his first marriage and who had stayed by his side through every storm. It's a bit touching, in a weirdly Tudor way. Out of all the flatterers and the power-hungry dukes, it was the quiet, scholarly Cranmer he wanted at the finish line. The trouble was, Cranmer was miles away in Croydon. They sent a rider out into the freezing night, the horse's hooves drumming a frantic rhythm on the frozen mud. Imagine that poor messenger, spurred on by the knowledge that every second he spent in the saddle was a second the king was moving closer to the great unknown. Meanwhile, back in Whitehall, the room had fallen into that particular terrifying silence, where even the sound of a falling coal in the grate feels like a gunshot. The courtiers stood in the shadows, their faces pale in the candlelight, watching the rise and fall of that massive chest. It was slower now, much slower. It was around midnight when the king really began to slip. He couldn't speak anymore. The power of the great Harry, the voice that had commanded armies and broken churches, was gone. He was just a man, frightened and alone in the dark. Maybe he saw the faces of the people he'd sent to the block in those final hours. Did Anne Boleyn or Thomas More wander through the corridors of his failing mind? It's a nice bit of poetic justice to imagine, though I suspect the reality was much more about the immediate, grinding physical struggle to pull in one more lungful of air. Cranmer finally arrived, breathless and splattered with mud, his robes dishevelled. He rushed to the bedside, probably still shivering from the cold of the journey. By then, Henry was beyond words. He was drifting in that twilight space between here and whatever comes next. Cranmer took the king's hand, that large, puffy hand that had signed so many death warrants, and he begged Henry to give him some sign, some tiny token that he trusted in the Lord. And then It happened. It's one of those moments in history that feels scripted for a film, but it actually happened. Henry didn't speak. He couldn't. But he gripped Cranmer's hand. He gave it a firm, conscious squeeze. It was a final, silent communication, a last spark of the old will flashing through the darkness. For Cranmer, that squeeze was everything. It was the king's confession, his final Amen. To the reformers, it was proof that Henry died in the true faith. To everyone else, it was just the final twitch of a dying giant. The end, when it came at about 2 a.m. on the 28th of January, was surprisingly quiet. There was no great cry, no dramatic last words about the state of the nation, just a long, rattling exhale, and then nothing. The silence that followed must have been absolutely deafening. For 38 years, England had pulsed to the heartbeat of this one man. Now, that heart had stopped. The room was suddenly devoid of the gravity that had held everything together. You can imagine the scene perfectly. The flickering candles, the smell of the guttering wicks, and the sudden, awkward shuffling of the men in the room as they realised they were now standing in the presence of a corpse rather than a king. Cranmer probably stayed there for a long time, still holding that heavy hand, perhaps praying, or perhaps just stunned by the sheer finality of it. The supreme head was dead. The man who had defied the Pope and changed the map of the English mind was now just a collection of cooling flesh and bone. But the drama was only just beginning, you see. In a normal world, the bells would have started tolling immediately, and the criers would have been out in the streets. But this wasn't a normal world. This was the Tudor court. The king's breath had stopped, but the fiction of his life had to be maintained for just a little bit longer. There were wills to be manipulated and power to be seized before the rest of the world could be allowed to know that the throne was empty. The men in that room looked at each other across the bed, and in that silent exchange, a new kind of fear was born. It wasn't the fear of Henry's temper anymore. It was the fear of what happened next. The vacuum he left behind was so enormous that it threatened to suck them all in. They had to move fast. They had to be cold. They had to be professional. It's a bit of a grim irony, isn't it? Henry had spent his life making sure he was the centre of everyone's universe. And yet, the moment he died, the very first thing his loyal servants did was decide to keep his death a secret so they could plot behind his back. It was the ultimate betrayal, and yet it was the only way they knew how to survive. The king was dead, but the king had to live on for 3 more days, a ghost sitting on a throne of lies while the world outside London went about its business, totally unaware that the Tudor sun had finally set. It makes you think about the nature of power. All those palaces, all those wives, all that blood spilled, and it all ends with a muddy archbishop holding a cold hand in a room that smells of rot and burnt wax. It's quite a humbling thought, really. No matter how big you think you are, the room eventually goes quiet, and the people you trust most start checking their watches and wondering where the keys are kept. And while Whitehall sat in its heavy, secretive silence, the king's body began its own, much less dignified journey toward the earth. It is one of the most audacious, slightly absurd and profoundly Tudor things I can think of, this 3-day gap between the king's final breath and the rest of the world being let in on the secret. He was dead, utterly, completely, and quite inconveniently dead. But while the physical form of Henry had ceased its laborious effort to exist at 2 a.m. on Friday, the political machine required his ghost to keep sitting on the throne until every I was dotted and every T was crossed by men who were, quite frankly, making it up as they went along. Imagine the scene if you can. The king is a cold, heavy weight in the bed, yet the palace of Whitehall continues to hum as if he's merely having a slightly more stubborn lie-in than usual. It was a masterpiece of theatre, a colossal, silent secret held by a handful of men who knew that their lives and the future of the English church depended on a perfectly timed reveal. The primary architects of this charade were, as you might have guessed, Edward Seymour and Sir William Paget. They needed time. They needed to get their ducks in a row, which in this case meant securing the person of the 9-year-old Prince Edward before any of their rivals could get a whiff of the news. So, they just didn't tell anyone. For 3 whole days, the Privy Chamber remained a stage, The most bizarre part of it all was the service of the king's meals. It's the sort of detail that sounds like a dark comedy, really. At the appointed hours, the sewers and the pages would bring in the massive silver trays piled high with the king's favourite meats. They would walk through the presence chamber, bowing to an empty room, and carry the steaming food into the bedchamber where the dead king lay. They would go through the motions of the tasting, the carving, the quiet ceremony of a royal lunch, all while the man who was supposed to eat it was becoming a cold monument to mortality. You have to wonder what the servants thought, the ones who weren't in on the conspiracy. Did they notice the silence? Did they wonder why the king hadn't roared for a specific wine or thrown a piece of gristle at a dog? Or were they just so conditioned by decades of fear that they simply did as they were told, eyes down, hearts thumping, not daring to ask why the air in the room was growing increasingly stale? I think it was a mixture of both. In the Tudor court, curiosity was a very dangerous trait. It was much safer to just carry the tray in, carry the tray out, and not think too much about why the king wasn't touching his venison. While this pantomime was playing out in London, Edward Seymour was already in the saddle, galloping toward the prince. He had to be the one to tell the boy. He had to be the one to bring the new king to London. It was about optics, you see. If you are the one holding the new king's hand, you are the one the rest of the world looks to for orders. It was a heist, really, but with silk and seals instead of masks and crowbars. Back at Whitehall, the gates were kept shut. No one was allowed in or out without a very good reason. The official story was that the king was indisposed, a lovely vague word that has covered a multitude of sins throughout British history. Even the Parliament was kept in the dark. On Saturday, the House of Lords and the House of Commons met as usual. The Lord Chancellor, Wriothesley, who was one of the Conservative faction and likely had a very good idea that something was up, had to preside over a session of a parliament that was technically dissolved the second Henry died. It was a massive legal black hole. They were passing laws and discussing taxes for a dead man. It's a bit like a ghost ship. The crew is still working the ropes and polishing the brass, but there's nobody at the helm and the captain has been overboard for miles. The psychological strain on Paget and the others must have been immense. Every hour that passed was an hour where someone might slip up. A stray word to a wife, a nervous look to a guard, or even just the mounting smell, which no amount of rosemary could truly suppress by the third day, could have brought the whole house of cards down. They were playing for the highest stakes imaginable. If the news leaked before Seymour had the prince, the Conservative Howards or even the Lady Mary might have made a move. It was a race against the very process of biological decay. I find it quite fascinating, the sheer cheek of it. It tells you everything you need to know about how power functioned in that building. Power wasn't about the man. It was about the appearance of the man. As long as the trays went in and the doors stayed shut, Henry was still king. His authority was a garment that they were keeping draped over a corpse until they had a new, smaller body to put it on. It's a very dry, very cynical way of looking at the world, but then these were men who had survived nearly 4 decades of Henry's whims. They didn't have much room left for sentimentality. By the Sunday, the tension must have been near a breaking point. Seymour had reached the prince at Hertford and was bringing him toward Enfield. The plan was moving into its final phase. Imagine the quiet conversations in the corridors of Whitehall that night, the whispered updates on horsemen and road conditions. They were almost there. One more night of serving dinner to a ghost. One more night of the guards standing watch over a silence that was becoming louder by the second. It wasn't until Monday morning, the 31st of January, that the seal was finally broken. The Lord Chancellor stood before the Parliament and, with a voice that I think was a bit tight, finally announced that the king had passed away. There were genuine tears, apparently. Not necessarily for the man, but for the end of an era. Henry had been the only king most people in that room had ever known. He was a constant, like the weather or the tide. To hear that he was gone, even if you'd suspected it for days, must have felt like the floor suddenly vanishing beneath your feet. But even then, the manipulation didn't stop. They read out the king's will, or at least the version of it that suited the new regime. They talked about the peaceful passing and the king's final wishes, glossing over the fact that they'd been sitting on the news for 72 hours like a group of cats, with a particularly large canary. The transition was done. The coup was a success. The boy was the king, and Edward Seymour was the man behind the boy. It's a strange, lingering thought, though, those 3 days of silence. The king, the great terrifying Henry, just lying there while his friends used his death as a political head start. It's a bit of a hollow end for a man who wanted to be remembered as a god. He wasn't even allowed the dignity of an immediate mourning. He was just a pawn in his own funeral. And while the bells finally started to toll across London, and the common folk began to process the news, the real work of dealing with the physical reality of Henry was only just beginning. Because, you see, a king of that size who had been dead for 3 days in a heated palace was about to become a very practical, very gruesome problem for the royal undertakers. Once the political theatre had finally folded its tents, and the secret was out in the open, the focus shifted from the abstract concept of power to the very concrete, very heavy reality of the king's remains. It's one thing to plot a regency, it's quite another to deal with £500 of Tudor monarch that has been sitting in a warm room for 3 days. The task fell to the royal surgeons and the apothecaries, and I don't envy them one bit. They weren't just undertakers in the modern sense. They were more like specialised butchers tasked with a job that was equal parts science, ritual, and sheer back-breaking labour. To put it bluntly, Henry was a logistical nightmare even in death. The process of embalming in the 16th century was a bit of a messy business, a far cry from the clinical chemical methods we use today. The goal was to preserve the body for the long, elaborate funeral ceremonies that were expected of a king, but with Henry they were starting from behind the 8 ball. Because of the delay, the internal gases were already doing what they do best, and the sheer volume of him made the standard procedures nearly impossible. The first step, a bit of a grisly one I'm afraid, was the evisceration. The internal organs, the heart, the lungs, the liver had to be removed. These were usually buried separately in lead caskets, often in a different location, a final way of spreading the royal presence around. Imagine the surgeons, men like Thomas Vickery, standing over that massive frame in the guttering candlelight. They had to navigate layers of fat and the catastrophic damage done by the king's lifelong devotion to the banquet table. It wasn't just about the organs, though. They had to deal with the brain, usually extracted through the nose with a hook, and the various fluids that come with a body that has essentially suffered from systemic organ failure and massive edema. The smell, even with the windows thrown open to the freezing January air, must have been something that stayed with those men for the rest of their lives. They used huge quantities of vinegar and wine to wash the cavity, a desperate attempt to sanitize a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of control. Once emptied, the king was stuffed. It sounds a bit like taxidermy, doesn't it? And in a way, it was. They used a mixture of aromatic herbs and spices, myrrh, frankincense, cloves, and cinnamon. These were incredibly expensive commodities, literally worth their weight in gold, and they were used in industrial quantities. The idea was that the spices would absorb the moisture, and more importantly, mask the scent of decay. They were trying to turn Henry into a sort of giant royal potpourri. But you can only do so much with a bit of cinnamon when you're dealing with a body that was already rotting from the inside out before the heart even stopped. Then came the sewing. They had to stitch him back up with heavy thread, a task that required a certain amount of physical strength given the tension of the skin. Once he was as preserved as they could manage, the body was wrapped in multiple layers of cerecloth. This was linen that had been soaked in a mixture of melted wax, resin and oil. They'd wrap it tight, layer after layer, creating a sort of waterproof, airtight cocoon. It was meant to keep the outside world out and the inside reality in. But again, the scale of the man meant they needed hundreds of yards of the stuff. By the time they were finished, the king must have looked less like a man and more like a massive, shapeless bolt of fabric. But the real challenge, the bit that would eventually lead to the horror we're building toward, was the coffin. A king of Henry's stature couldn't just be popped into a wooden box. He required a coffin of lead, which was then placed inside a larger outer shell of solid oak. The lead lining was crucial. It was meant to be the final barrier, soldered shut to ensure that no corrupt vapours could escape during the weeks of lying in state and the slow procession to Windsor. Lead is heavy, and lead is unforgiving. When you combine the weight of the king, the weight of the spices and cerecloth, and the weight of the lead itself, you're looking at something that weighed well over a ton. The soldering was a delicate job. They had to use hot irons to melt the lead seams together, creating a permanent seal. Think about the plumber or the smith who had to do that. You're leaning over this massive wax-wrapped colossus, the heat of your tools mingling with the scent of the spices and the underlying stubborn pong of the king's ulcers. One tiny gap, one weak spot in the solder, and the whole thing is compromised. And in their haste, or perhaps because of the sheer difficulty of working with a shape that was so irregular, it seems they didn't do quite as perfect a job as they thought. The physics of it are quite simple, really, and quite terrifying. If you seal a decomposing body inside an airtight lead box, the gases produced by the bacteria have nowhere to go. Pressure begins to build. It's like a slow-motion explosion waiting to happen. The more mass there is, and Henry had mass in spades, the more gas is produced. They were essentially creating a biological pressure cooker, wrapped in lead and oak, and then they were going to haul it across the English countryside in the middle of winter. While the surgeons were finishing their grim work, the rest of the palace was being transformed. Black cloth was being hung over every surface. The great hall was being prepared for the lying in state, where the coffin would sit under a magnificent hearse, a sort of temporary wooden canopy covered in hundreds of flickering candles. It was all about the spectacle, the grand, solemn exit of a man who had lived his life as a one-man show. But beneath all the velvet and the heraldry, beneath the chanting of the monks and the weeping of the courtiers, there was this ticking clock of biology. The men who did the embalming were paid well for their trouble, and I suspect they earned every penny. It was a job that required a peculiar kind of stoicism. You had to look at the supreme head of the church and see him not as a god, but as a problem of volume and preservation. They did their best with what they had, but they were fighting a losing battle against the very nature of the king's body. Henry had been a man of excess in every sense of the word, and his death was proving to be just as excessive, just as difficult to contain, as his life had been. As they finally heaved the lead-lined inner coffin into the great oak outer casing, I wonder if any of them felt a sense of foreboding. Did they hear a faint hiss of air? Did they notice a slight bulge in the metal? Probably not. They were likely just exhausted, desperate to wash the scent of the king off their hands and get a bit of sleep before the funeral ceremonies began in earnest. They'd done their part. They'd turned the great Harry into a monument. Now it was up to the carters and the pallbearers to move that monument to its final resting place. And as the heavy lid was finally hammered down, the stage was set for a journey that would turn from a solemn procession into a scene of absolute undignified horror. It was on the 14th of February that the great lumbering machine of the state finally groaned into motion. By then, the king had been dead for over a fortnight, and the atmosphere in London had shifted from a sort of sharp, icy shock to a heavy, weary resignation. The weather had decided to be particularly uncooperative, as is often the case with English winters, providing a landscape of slate-grey skies and mud that was as thick and clingy as cold porridge. This wasn't just a funeral, you see, it was a migration of power. Moving the king's remains from Whitehall to his final resting place at Windsor was a distance of some 22 miles, which sounds like a quick Sunday drive to us, but in 1547, with a cargo that weighed as much as a small cottage, it was a proper logistical palaver. The chariot built for the occasion was a staggering piece of engineering. It was a massive, open-sided wagon, draped in the finest black velvet and topped with a magnificent canopy. Upon it sat a lifelike effigy of the king, dressed in his royal robes, wearing a crown and clutching a sceptre. It was a bit of a surreal sight, really. This waxen, idealized version of Henry staring out at the world with glass eyes, while the real man, the lead-wrapped, spice-stuffed reality of him, sat in the darkness below. The carriage was pulled by 8 massive horses, each one covered in black trappings that swept the ground. Those poor beasts, their breath huffing out in clouds of white steam as they strained against the harness to move the ton of lead and oak behind them. The procession was 4 miles long. Think about that for a second. If you stood at one spot on the road, it would take hours for the whole thing to pass you by. It wasn't just the coffin, of course. There were thousands of people involved. You had the high nobility, the dukes and earls, all riding in their mourning black, their faces set in expressions of practised grief. There were hundreds of poor men, given new black gowns and torches to carry, walking in a flickering, smoky line that stretched out across the winter landscape. There were the choirs singing the dirge in a low, rhythmic chant that must have sounded quite ghostly as it echoed off the bare trees. It was a spectacle of enormous, crushing weight, both literally and metaphorically. As they left the city, the crowds were silent. There's something about the sheer scale of a royal funeral that tends to hush even the most rowdy of Londoners. People stood by the roadside, hats in hands, watching the great Harry pass for the very last time. There was a fair bit of relief mixed in with the awe. For almost 40 years, this man had been the absolute centre of their universe. He had changed their religion, he had raised their taxes, he had executed their heroes, and he had generally loomed over their lives like a thunderstorm that never quite broke. And now he was just a box on wheels, moving slowly toward the earth. The destination for the first night was Sion Abbey, a place that held a rather dark and ironic significance in Henry's story. Situated on the banks of the Thames, Sion had once been a prosperous Brigittine monastery, one of the wealthiest and most prestigious in the country. But during the dissolution of the monasteries, Henry had swept through it with his usual brutal efficiency. He'd turned the monks and nuns out, executed the ones who resisted, and claimed the lands for the crown. It had been used as a prison for Catherine Howard before she was taken to the block, and now it was to serve as a temporary resting place for her husband's corpse. There's a certain grim poetry to that, isn't there? A man who had dismantled the holy places of England was now forced to seek shelter within their ruins. The journey to Sion was a slow, agonizing crawl. The roads were in a shocking state, even by Tudor standards. The heavy wheels of the chariot bit deep into the soft earth, and at several points it looked as though the whole thing might tip over into the ditch. Imagine the panic that would have caused. The nobles and the guards would have had to put their shoulders to the wheel, their expensive silk stockings and velvet boots getting absolutely ruined in the muck. It was a very human, very messy business. There was no dignity in the mud. The king, who had spent his life being carried on silk cushions, was now being jolted and bounced along like a sack of turnips. And all the while, inside that lead-lined box, the physical laws I mentioned earlier were still at work. The movement of the carriage, the constant vibration and the tilting of the coffin probably wasn't helping the structural integrity of the solder. Every bump in the road, every sudden lurch as a wheel found a hole, was a test of the plumber's work. The pressure of the gases was reaching its peak. It's quite a grisly thought, the idea of this silent, invisible force building up inside the lead, even as the choirs sang their beautiful, mournful Latin and the torches flickered in the wind. By the time they reached Sion, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long, jagged shadows across the river. The ruins of the abbey must have looked particularly desolate in the fading light. They carried the coffin into the chapel, which had been cleared of its former inhabitants, but still held the chill of a place that had seen better days. It was placed on a hearse, not a vehicle in this context, but a massive wooden frame filled with hundreds of candles. The flickering light played over the black velvet and the royal arms, creating a scene of sombre, artificial beauty. The watchers were appointed. These were the men who had to stay with the king all night, keeping a vigil in the freezing cold. Huddled in their cloaks, the silence of the abbey may be broken only by the crackle of the candles and the occasional distant call of a night bird. They were exhausted, no doubt, and probably more than a little spooked. The atmosphere in that chapel was heavy with the weight of the past. You had the ghosts of the monks Henry had killed, the memory of the queen he had discarded, and the physical presence of the man himself, resting in his leaden suit. It was during this night, in the quietest hours between midnight and dawn, that the real horror began to unfold. While the world outside was asleep, and the watchers were perhaps nodding off in the cold, the great Harry was about to make his presence felt in a way that no one could have predicted. It wasn't through a ghostly apparition or a voice from beyond the grave, but through the simple, brutal reality of biology. The vessel was about to burst, and the resulting scene would be something that no amount of incense or prayer could ever truly cleanse. It's the moment where the legend of the king meets the reality of the animal, and the results, I'm afraid, are not for the faint of heart. The night at Sion Abbey was, by all accounts, an exceptionally quiet one, at least on the surface of things. You have to imagine the scene. A cavernous, half-ruined chapel, the air so cold you could see your own breath hitching in the candlelight, and that massive, velvet-draped bulk sitting right in the centre of it all like some silent, brooding god. The men assigned to the vigil, the watchers, were likely huddled in their heavy woolen cloaks, their bums numb from the stone floor, probably wishing they were anywhere else. They'd have been nursing small cups of ale, perhaps, or just staring into the flickering flames of the hundreds of candles that were meant to represent the king's eternal light. But nature, as it often does when faced with human pretension, had a very different sort of illumination in mind. You see, while the guards were nodding off and the wind was whistling through the gaps in the masonry where Henry's men had stripped the lead from the roof years before, the king's body was undergoing a bit of a biological rebellion. It's a basic matter of physics, really, and quite a dry one if you look at it on paper. When a body decomposes, especially one as large and as, well marbled as Henry's, it produces a staggering amount of methane and hydrogen sulfide. If you seal that process inside a lead coffin that has been soldered shut with more enthusiasm than expertise, you aren't just creating a tomb, you're building a bomb, a very slow, very smelly biological pressure cooker. At some point in the small hours, the internal pressure simply became too much for the metal to bear. It wasn't a bang in the sense of a cannon going off, I don't think. It would have been more of a dull, heavy clunk, followed by a long, sustained hiss. The lead seams, stressed to their absolute limit by the gases of a man who had spent 40 years eating everything in sight, finally gave way. The solder cracked, and once that seal was broken, the corrupt vapours and the accumulated fluids of the king's decay began to find their way out. The next morning, when the plumbers and the household staff arrived to prepare for the next leg of the journey, they were met with a sight that must have turned even the strongest of Tudor stomachs. The black velvet pall, that expensive, prestigious fabric, was soaked through with a dark, putrid liquid that had seeped out from the bottom of the coffin and was pooling on the stone floor. It was a total catastrophe for the theatre of royalty. This was the man who had claimed to be the supreme head of the church, the man who had bent the world to his will, and here he was, literally leaking through the floorboards of a ruined abbey he'd stolen from the church. It's a bit of a come-down. There is a story, recorded by a contemporary, that makes this whole thing even more macabre. As the workmen were trying to clean up the mess, a job that I imagine involved a lot of gagging and probably a fair bit of praying, they noticed some movement in the shadows. You see, the abbey wasn't entirely empty. It had its fair share of stray dogs, the sort of scruffy, half-starved curs that hang around the edges of any great house. According to the account, a dog had slipped into the chapel and was discovered licking up the moisture from the floor beneath the king's coffin. It's a detail so specific and so utterly undignified that you almost couldn't make it up. It strips away all the gold leaf and the heraldry, leaving you with nothing but the raw animal reality of death. The plumbers who had to fix the leak, the poor chaps having to climb under that massive dripping weight with their soldering irons and their lead patches, trying to seal back in the very thing that had just burst out. It must have been a job from hell. They were literally working in a cloud of the king's essence, a scent so potent it was said to have hung around the abbey for weeks. They were trying to put the genie back in the bottle, but the bottle was a ton of lead, and the genie was a rotting monarch. It was a losing game from the start. The psychological impact on the courtiers who witnessed this must have been profound. In the 16th century, people were very attuned to signs and omens. To see the king's body fail in such a spectacular and messy way wasn't just a bit of bad luck. It was seen as a comment on his character, or perhaps a divine judgment on his life. After all, this was the place where Catherine Howard had been imprisoned. This was the place where the monks had been cast out. To have the king's physical form literally dissolve on the very spot where he'd caused so much misery felt like a bit of cosmic justice. It's the sort of thing that gets whispered about in the kitchens and the stables, even if you wouldn't dare mention it to the new protector. It's quite a jarring image. The grand procession, the 4 miles of mourning black, the gold and the incense, and then this messy, leaky reality in the dark of a ruined chapel. It shows the fragility of the whole Tudor project. They spent so much time and money trying to make Henry look like something more than human. And yet, in the end, he was subject to the same messy, undignified rules of biology as the poorest beggar in the street. Actually, probably more so, given the sheer volume of him they were trying to contain. The morning light would have shown the true extent of the shambles. The velvet ruined, the stone floor stained, the smell overwhelming even the strongest herbs. They had to work fast to make the king presentable again for the final stretch to Windsor. They probably threw more spices on, replaced the velvet, and did their best to scrub the floor, but the secret was out. The men who were there knew. The story began to circulate, morphing and growing as it went, as stories always do. It became part of the legend of Henry VIII. Not the legend of the great king, but the legend of the man who was too big for his own coffin. The dry stamp men, Paget and Seymour, during all this. Were they embarrassed, or were they just annoyed at the delay? I suspect the latter. They had a kingdom to run and a young king to manage. A leaky coffin was just a bit of a nuisance, a logistical hiccup in their plan for total control. But for the people on the ground, the ones who had to deal with the smell and the dogs and the cracked lead, it was a moment they'd never forget. It was the point where the king stopped being a figure of fear and started being a bit of a gruesome punchline. It's a strange, lingering sort of horror. Not a quick shock, but a slow, seeping realization that everything we build to protect our dignity, the lead, the velvet, the titles, is ultimately just a temporary measure. Eventually the pressure builds up, the seams crack, and the truth leaks out. And in Henry's case, the truth was a particularly messy one. As the sun rose over the Thames and they prepared to heave that massive weight back onto the chariot for the final mile, the atmosphere must have been one of grim, silent determination. They just wanted him in the ground. They wanted the box shut and the earth piled high before anything else could go wrong. But the road to Windsor was still ahead of them, and the ghosts of the past weren't quite finished with the great Harry just yet. The morning of the 15th of February saw the procession pulling away from the grim memories of Sion Abbey, with a palpable sense of urgency. The leak had been patched, the velvet replaced, and the air around the chariot thick with an almost aggressive amount of fresh incense. They were on the home stretch now, the final miles toward Windsor Castle, which sat perched on its chalk bluff like a silent, stony sentinel watching the slow crawl of the dead king's court. The mood among the nobles was one of exhausted desperation. They had been on the road for 2 days in the biting cold. Their finery was likely splattered with mud, and the great Harry was proving to be just as difficult a guest in death as he had been in life. Windsor was, and still is, the spiritual home of the English monarchy. It was where Henry had spent some of his happiest days, hunting in the great park and presiding over the lavish ceremonies of the Order of the Garter. But as the chariot groaned up the steep ascent toward the castle gates, the atmosphere was anything but festive. The bells of St. George's Chapel began a heavy, rhythmic tolling that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. This was the end of the line. There were no more miles to cover, no more abbeys to ruin, and no more secrets to keep. The physical reality of Henry VIII was finally going to be put out of sight. The interior of St. George's Chapel is a masterpiece of perpendicular Gothic architecture, all soaring stone fans and delicate carvings. But on that day, it was transformed into a cavern of mourning. Henry had left very specific instructions for his burial. He didn't want to be in Westminster Abbey with the rest of the crowd. He wanted to be here, in the choir of St. George's, laid to rest beside Jane Seymour. She was the true wife, the one who had given him the son he'd broken the world to obtain. There is something almost touching about that, isn't there? Amidst all the wives he'd divorced, executed, or ignored, he chose to spend eternity beside the woman who died, giving him what he wanted most. It's a very Henry version of romance, utilitarian, slightly tragic, and deeply focused on his own legacy. Getting that ton of lead and oak into the ground was a final Herculean task. A section of the floor in the centre of the choir had been lifted, revealing a dark, narrow opening into the vault below. The pallbearers, the highest-ranking men in the land, had to navigate this final indignity. Imagine the strain on their backs and the sweat on their brows as they lowered the great Harry into the darkness. One slip, one snapped rope, and the king would have crashed into the vault like a falling mountain. But the machinery held. The coffin descended slowly, disappearing from the light of the candles and into the cold silence of the earth. Once the coffin was settled, the final, most symbolic act of the Tudor state took place. The great officers of the household, the Lord Chamberlain, the Lord Steward and others, stepped forward. They held their white wands of office, the symbols of their authority under Henry. One by one, they snapped the wood over their knees and threw the pieces into the vault. It was a powerful gesture. It meant that their service to this king was over. The bond was broken. The great Harry was no longer their master. He was now just a resident of the Windsor soil. As the pieces of wood clattered onto the lead lid of the coffin, the Garter King of Arms stepped forward and proclaimed the new reality in a voice that filled the chapel. "The king is dead. Long live the king." In that moment, the weight of the past 38 years shifted. The focus moved instantly from the man in the hole to the 9-year-old boy standing in London. The era of the giant was officially over. There is a final irony to Henry's burial that I think speaks volumes about his character. He had planned a monument for himself that would have been the most magnificent in Europe, a massive bronze and marble structure featuring an equestrian statue of himself, surrounded by angels and saints. It was to be a literal mountain of ego. But because he had spent so much money on wars and palaces, the monument was never finished. The bronze was eventually melted down, and the magnificent sarcophagus he'd planned for himself ended up being used for Lord Nelson centuries later. Henry, the man who wanted to be remembered in gold and stone, lies today beneath a simple, flat marble slab in the floor of the choir. You could walk over him and never even know he was there. It's a remarkably humble end for a man whose life was defined by its lack of humility. As the mourners filed out of the chapel and back into the cold afternoon air, the world felt different. The great Harry was gone. He left behind a fractured church. England was no longer part of the Roman fold, but it wasn't quite Protestant either. A massive debt. The royal coffers were empty, drained by his vanity and his wars. A fragile succession, a young boy on the throne and 2 daughters who had been declared illegitimate and then reinstated. He had been a force of nature, a man who had reshaped the very DNA of his country. But in the end, he was just a man who had leaked through a floorboard at Sion and been lowered into a dark hole in Windsor. The drama of his life was over, and the chaos of his legacy was just beginning. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? We build these great monuments to ourselves. We fight these massive battles for power and prestige, and in the end, the earth just waits for us, indifferent to our titles and our tantrums. The Tudor sun hadn't set yet. Elizabeth was still to come after all, but the particular terrifying heat of Henry's reign had finally cooled. The giant was in the ground, the wands were broken, and the rest of history was waiting to be written by the survivors.